Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to the sixth webinar of this series of six webinars on kind of global conversations, an attempt really to sort of uh, provide a kind of democratized kind of knowledge forum in which we hear voices from different parts of the world, from different perspectives, different disciplines, but all speaking about a big question which is of importance in world politics at this time. And we've had a number of different interesting topics which sort of speak in a way to the theme of the international system of power. And we've had quite a broad diversity of speakers as well. And I think that overall, I certainly have learned a lot. Obviously, I've been attending all of them. I've been hearing such interesting uh, perspectives and research and making connections that I hadn't in before, as well as being far better informed about so many aspects of the international system, particularly in regard to the interactions of elements of the global north with the global south as well. So as I said, this is the sixth in the series of six, the first series. We do have another series already pretty much set up, and that's going to begin on Friday, the 7th of May, and run for 6 weeks every Friday from then. And I'm very excited about that series, actually. I just want to say a couple of words. We have the first one to kick off the second series is a discussion on the idea of China. Everyone has an idea about China. It'd be interesting to hear three different perspectives on what China is and what it stands for. The following one, after that, the second one is on the global power elite and world politics. The third one is on beyond Eurocentrism, the global South's ideational and political influence in world affairs. The fourth one is on white supremacy and racial capitalism in world politics. The fifth one is periphery war, global impact, the Iraq wars and world order. And the final one is on religion and world politics. So, and actually I've got about six other planned for the autumn as well, but I'm not going to go into that at the moment. It's a little bit premature for that. But the number of ideas which are coming in from different supporters and people, keep them please coming in, and we will do our very best to sort of create a program which is informative, challenging, interesting, and inclusive, and really tries to sort of make these intellectual connections where maybe we don't get as many opportunities to put people in the same room from such diverse perspectives themselves. And as you know, we're trying to do some working papers from this series as well. So we ask our presenters to write a few thousand words based on their presentation. And we are recording this, and obviously we all tweet and email and everything else afterwards, this particular webinar, and plus the other five we've already sent out. And we're also trying to work out a way in which to do podcasts based on these recordings as well. So we're trying to disseminate in various ways. And we do see this as, if you like, a resource which can be used in class for teaching, to try to broaden the curriculum as appropriate. Uh, Part of the inspiration of this series is this kind of idea of decolonizing the curriculum, and what a decolonized discussion and debate forum might look like in practice. So rather than debating the necessity for that process, is to actually try to realize it in practice in this particular forum. There are lots of other people in other parts of the world who are doing very similar kinds of things as well. So it's very, very useful. But one of the uses we feel from this could be that the students, lecturers and teachers could use some of the material for their teaching. And I think that could be an easy way of having a resource of a variety of types, written, audio, as well as visual as well. So we'll be discussing that a little bit more as we go further. So as you know, we've got really good following from different groups around the world, not as many as we want and would like, but several. And today I'm glad to say that at least one representative of the Brazilian Association Friends is here today, and Juvaria will be introducing Tatiana in a minute. And we have The Wire in India, the news website based in New Delhi. We have the Center for Hemispheric and US Studies at the University of Havana. We have INCT-INEU in Brazil, the Brazilian Studies Association for studying the United States politics, history, and foreign policy, as well as the University of West London, Global Partnerships Network at Kassel University, and LSE Ideas, and of course City University, where Juvaria and I are based. So it's got good support, and we're always looking for more support as well, particularly from Global South associations, groups of scholars and practitioners. So if you are out there and you want to get more associated with this program, then please do get in touch with either myself or Juvaria, and we'd be really glad to hear from you. So that's all I'm going to say. Each speaker is going to get about 20 minutes, and I'll pass over to my co-host and collaborator, Juvaria, who is also speaking today, to introduce the speakers and herself as well. Thank you, Juvaria.
Thank you, Inderjeet. So today's session is about knowledge and power. So we have an interesting range of perspectives from a very impressive group of speakers assembled here virtually. First of all, we will have a talk by Tatiana Teixiera. She's a visiting lecturer at the Institute of International Relations and Defense at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She's also a researcher at the National Institute of Science and Technology for studies about the United States.
Juvaria, your speaker seems to be, there's a lot of static or interference. No, there's a sort of strange bit of feedback or something.
Let me just switch to my computer. Here.
Can you say something again? Can't hear you now. You're muted, actually.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's very clear.
Okay, sure. So I was just introducing Tatiana, and she's also a researcher at the National Institute of Science and Technology for studies about the United States, as well as editor at the Political Observatory for the United States, that's OPU. We also have with us Ferran Perez Mena, who is a doctoral researcher in international relations, security, and global governance at the University of Sussex. His main area of research focuses on the production of international relations, theory in East Asia and East Asian social movements. He has degrees from the Autonomous University of Barcelona and from the National Tsinghua University in Taiwan. We also have with us today Urvashi Sarkar. She's an independent journalist based in India. She writes on international politics, gender, and culture. Her reporting has covered a range of issues, including foreign policy and think tanks, climate change, refugee issues, education, nuclear policy, and the United Nations. She has reported from India, Bangladesh, Palestine, and the United States. And the final talk will be from me. My name is Juvaria Jafri. I'm based at City University of London. I am a lecturer in international political economy. I'm also currently a visiting professor with the GPN at the University of Kassel for the 20 to 21 winter term. My research interests are in development, finance, and philanthropy. Thank you. Looking forward to your presentations.
Great. So Tatiana, please, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again, Professor Parmar, for your invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and share with you some of the findings and conclusions of my PhD research. And also, I would say, share some of the challenges as a Brazilian researcher on American studies doing the research in the US. And thank you, Juvaria, for your introduction, for the organization of this event, your help, and for always being accessible. It matters a lot to me. Well, my research was about American think tanks and their production about Brazil. And by that, I mean not only their written material like reports, policy briefs, and books, working papers, and so on, but also the events, conference, interviews for media outlets, hearings at the Senate, etc. And in both cases, for interviews and hearings, these are two among the most favored indicators from think tanks to give the sensation and reinforce the perception that they are influential and that they have great visibility, as we already know. Well, what prompted me to do this research was the need to better understand a subject that, in my opinion, can greatly influence Brazil's image and reputation, Brazil's reputation abroad. We had, and we still have, few works made by Brazilian scholars on the phenomenon of these American policy institutes and their perceptions about Brazil. Well, it has already been said here 1,000 times, but I believe repeating is never enough, that America concerns over economic and security issues, especially since the World War II and after that, have been supported by high levels of government investment in research. And this has resulted in a huge knowledge base for scholars of US foreign policy and other areas of study in the US. And it highlights the strong comparative disadvantage for Brazil, but not only for Brazil and also for other developing nations in producing relevant knowledge about foreign affairs from their own perspectives. And I think it has totally to do with the purpose of this webinar series. So besides, if we understand and accept that, first, American think tanks are part of strategies to preserve and expand the power of hegemonic structures. Two, they are being increasingly influenced by the interests of donors and politicians. Three, they are immersed in a specific system of beliefs. And I would say, for a start, just say about the idea of American exceptionalism, which determines their symbolic capacity and therefore their production values and their impact on the political sphere. Can we rely solely on their analysis? So back to my dissertation after this, these ideas. Well, basically my research question was, is there a single or a diversified idea or mindset about Brazil in American think tanks? And of course, before trying to start to answer this question, I had first to step back and make an exploratory research to find out if Brazil was an object of interest in American think tanks. And it happens that, in fact, it was. So back to the idea of Brazil, I wanted to identify and map the concepts, images, and narratives that were being created and disseminated about Brazil in different audiences. Identify who were the main scholars talking around, it's like mapping people, right? Main scholars talking and writing about Brazil, their networks, their connections to power. And by that, I mean the connections they had with the executive power, the administration, and the Congress. And obviously, when we talk about these exchanges between think tanks, the administration and the Congress, we talk about the revolving door phenomenon and this interplay between these actors and institutions that promotes mutual legitimation of credentials, policies, programs, discourses, and agendas. And sometimes it's difficult to know who legitimizes who and what. Well, the time frame of my research was mainly Lula's administration. Who doesn't know him? It's the nickname for Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, former Brazil's president, between 2003 and 2010. And during this same period, we had W. Bush and Obama's administration in the United States. So why did I choose this time frame? Actually, it was a moment Brazil was having more visibility, and for an array of reasons, both domestic and international, and also a more assertive and preeminent role on the international stage. So I worked with 4 think tanks, and they were chosen because they were the ones that at the time they had more production and ongoing and regular activities about Brazil or Brazil and Latin America. They still go together. Both Brazil is barely still not seen outside the region. It's still seen inside Latin America. And it changed a little bit after Lula's government. It started to be seen more inside South America, but we still think doesn't look at Brazil like a country itself. Well, they were chosen also because the scholars, for example, were among the ones who were more invited to hearings at the Congress. Also, these 4 institutes had, and actually they still have, recognized high quality of work, and they are also considered somehow politically very influential. So I worked with Brookes Institution, CFR, Council on Foreign Relations, and Professor Parmar, for this one, you were obviously one of my main sources for literature review. Inter-American Dialogue, and Brazil Institute. This one is the only one specific about Brazil in the US, located at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC. So this is just very briefly part of my list of criteria I established, and which is more detailed in my dissertation, so I just move on. My field research was in 2012 when I went to the United States, and I spent almost a year doing my research in the US. I collected and analyzed their written stuff. I visited different think tanks and joined their meetings. And as it was a first for me, it was really impressive to see how they have this sort of convening power, and they are always gathering people to debate anything. It is a feature we need to be there and see it to truly understand its dynamics and how it works, and why does it matter, and how it can make ideas circulate and be influential in a certain level. Well, I also did some structured in-depth interviews. I interviewed their experts, distinguished Brazilians, like, well, give just a brief list, like Professors Wayne Selcher, Riordan Rowett, Abraham Lowenthal, Alexander White, Eric Hirschbeck, Hal Brands, Joseph Touching, Joseph Love, etc. I also interviewed scholars on think tanks, like Professors Donald Abenson, Tom Medveds, and James McCann, which was actually my American advisor. And I talked to some employees and ex-employees of the administration at that time, which was Obama's administration, including some people from the Department of State. And sorry, I cannot mention any of these names. But at this moment, I would like to point a first challenge, as I said at the beginning, for a foreign observer, which is to have access to a more insider information, cables, diplomatic documents, and also another difficulty is to have access to top-ranked authorities and key political players. So tracking influence and impact is even more difficult for us for foreigners, and especially under emerging and underdeveloping countries, since most of this happens behind the scenes. Besides the clear fact that I'm not American, I believe this might happen among other reasons because it takes a long time to build trust and to establish a connection with the potential source. So if I have to give a life hack for beginners now, I would say for the researchers, stay the maximum of time you can in the country, which is your object of study. So you can have a better final result. So what I saw in my research, just giving you now some of my findings. What I saw in my research was a pattern of a common script of what was there to be said about Brazil. And interestingly, I saw it in almost all of my interviews. At that time, the script was basically one, while talking about the current situation, and everything was detailed and appeared the same way in my interview. So for current situation, Brazil was the 6th major economy in the world in 2011 until mid 2012, a big and Pacific country, pre-salt fields, etc. So this second aspect, lasting challenges. So Brazil caused infrastructure problems, corruption, political reform, etc. And the final one, the bilateral relations, relations between the US and Brazil. Most scholars, they talked about, and this is also very common in the literature about this relation, eternal beginning, mutual misunderstanding. Brazil doesn't know what it wants, and this one was a very curious one because at that time Brazil seemed to be pretty sure of what it was seeking for on international stage. But okay, and shared values and democracy, etc. So we have what I saw there in the interviews, in the literature, was that we have a great homogeneity and circularity in the images and concepts produced and disseminated about Brazil. It is as if we had this block of ideas, crystallized ideas that go together to the US government or to the Congress. So it is as if we didn't have too much control or interference or action, and we didn't have our margin of agency as Brazilians would be smaller actually than we think. In Brazil, we have the same institutions and experts being considered legitimate and valid partners with credentials to talk about Brazil. There are, of course, some exceptions, but these exceptions, they are not voices strong enough to be heard. So that's, I believe, one of the main problems and something that left me pretty worried about the result and the impact of this dynamic for the vision and perception about Brazil. So this dynamic, and I'm saying this as a scholar, of course, but also as a citizen, this dynamics takes from us as a country the space and the right to have a counter narrative, a more plural vision of Brazil, seen by itself. And then I use it a lot, and I remember, I think it's a great source for this kind of work, Orientalism from Said, which says, well, it's so wonderful. We need to start to think about ourselves through our own lens and not through others. Well, one of the reasons why this matters, to have this knowledge and to understand these dynamics, is that the way a country is seen and perceived and has its image projected by other countries on the international stage, especially if you're talking about the US, still the most important power in the world, is that it can affect bilateral relations, and it can affect political decisions. It can make a country adopt bad strategic responses and take bad decisions in politics, for example. At the same time, I think for new students, it's important in this kind of research to look at more post-colonial theory, because considering the relations of power, identity, hegemonic disputes, I think it's the best way to look at this dynamic and understand how it works, and perhaps to think about a way to deal with this. Well, the other thing is to look at the production of these think tanks, the American think tanks, the ones I selected, but not on the ones I worked with, is that they can also be a very useful tool to, especially for policymakers, to see the agendas that will be coming for a specific government or the next one, and try to anticipate themselves in terms of decisions, in terms of partnerships, and not doing what is happening in Brazil nowadays and in other countries. So this knowledge, which we don't have in a deep level in Brazil, it is can be very helpful to identify groups and interests that can they converge and diverge from Brazil, and then we can seek for partners and allies, and for example, negotiations, as it happens, for example, in Cancun, as Brazil did for trade in 2003, I guess. So I have talked about Brazil and Latin America. And another point that I argue is that in many cases, Brazil, considering again all these dynamics that I have just described, Brazil's external image and its bilateral relationship with the US may be predetermined even before diplomatic actions are considered. They can be predetermined by the agendas of these think tanks connected to a specific US government, or by specific interests for groups in a specific political moment. And if we are not able, we don't have the knowledge to understand it and to see it and working and being implemented, we will have a better, shallow answer and to this as a political answer. So I have already talked about there is an intertextuality in the material produced by these different think tanks and their scholars. It is a very small group who they go to the same meetings, they read the same stuff, they do the interviews for the same vehicles, they are exchanging the same information. So it is a small group of people, I would say both Brazilianists and Latin Americanists, and they are very, there is a big cohesion, and they both quote each other, they read each other. So it seemed also very worrying that we have such a small circularity in terms of what is being said and thought and analyzed about Brazil. Well, I think these are some, I don't know how much more time do I have?
You have at least a minute.
Oh, so, okay. Well, okay, I can in Q&A session.
No, just keep going, keep going.
Okay. So I forgot to say one thing, and I think it's important because it talks about political bias from the think tanks. In my research, the four institutes that I have chosen, they are considered to be in the center, more or less in the center, having a center political orientation, center or center right, or depending on the moment. And depending on the issue, we know when it comes to national security and defense issues, mostly we have a more hawkish position. But when it comes to Brazil and Latin America, they are more at the center of the debate. And and these are the ones that have a more regular activity. When I was looking at the more rockish or more at the right of the political spectrum, these ones, they didn't have any program, any initiative established, political, any initiative about the region. And when it comes to Brazil or other country, they appear exactly in questions and areas related to national security and defense. The same happened to Latin America. So At that time, Brazil appeared in this more conservative, now comes the word, the conservative think tanks, when we had that imbroglio with Turkey and Iran, when Lula tried to mediate some deal, and also for Latin America, the most recurrent themes are Cuba, immigration, Venezuela, and also the Chinese expansion in the region. And this recent days, I was taking a look at these institutions, the one I was researching during my PhD, and they have changed. We don't have those programs or institutes about initiatives specifically about Brazil anymore. Brazil is nowadays inside Latin America, again, just Latin America. And we have, even for inter-American dialogue, which is the specific think tank for the Western Hemisphere, for the studies of the Western Hemisphere, Southern Core and Latin America, Central America, we have China there. So Asia and Latin America. So Asia, China is and spread all over. So this was the main area that Brazil and Latin America appeared in conservative think tanks, security, national security. In the case of Brazil, another interesting point I'd like to, and then I may conclude after that, is that there wasn't any big rupture. Can I say rupture? There wasn't a big rupture when we had a change of government, being Bush or Obama, when it comes Brazil and the US relations. And one of my hypotheses for that is that we have the same scholars dealing with the same information and with the same analysis and agendas about Brazil. So, but in terms of Brazil, these think tanks, they are very important for their capacity of networking. So if someone would start now to do a research about Brazil and the US and the work of think tanks, I would say start thinking about the network, the bridge, and their connections. This is really important when it comes to this area. So, well, I'll conclude. Before concluding, I'd like to say that I just love your tweet today with the description of our webinar. I think it's fundamentally about seeing and perceiving the other. And I'd like to thank you again, Professor, for the promotion of this incredible initiative. What my research showed to me at the first place was is that more than ever, we need to have these alternative spaces for debate, and with scholars from different and not the usual countries, and with different backgrounds and academic records. And from my perspective, being Latin America and Brazilian, in this other, in this new, I would say new because it's out of the mainstream, right? These arenas, we can go beyond the Western, I would put Western wall. And this wall is really solid, dense, almost impenetrable for us. So we can also, we can try to go beyond this, its Eurocentrism and American mindset and theory. So therefore, I sincerely hope you keep doing the seminars. I was really happy to hear your next series, and they give me hope. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. That was really interesting. Lots of interesting research there, and lots of questions in my mind that I would like to ask you, and I'll abuse my position as chair a bit later on. But thank you so much, Tatiana. We'll move now on to Ferran. About 20 minutes, Ferran.
Yeah, Cool. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen? Perfect. Okay, so good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Parmar for the kind invitation and Professor Jafri for helping with the logistics of this presentation. So it's a real honor for me to be here with you this afternoon. So before I start my presentation, I want to clarify that this is my doctoral project, which is work in progress. So I will really welcome any suggestions and feedback. So to give you some context about my thesis, I'm working on the evolution of the production of modern Chinese international thought since the late 19th century until now, with the aim of tracing the historical and structural dynamics that have shaped it. In some ways, I wanted to explore from a Chinese perspective, how did the Chinese higher scholars end up embracing this apparent novel idea of non-Western IR theory and global IR, when in China always existed a specific form of Chinese international thought. So in a way, although it's not the aim of my project, I'm trying to reconstruct the intellectual path that led to the Chinese School of IR. With this in mind, today I will provide a critical reflection on the emergence of the Chinese School of IR theory and an alternative materialist approach on the production of Chinese IR theory. So the key idea of this presentation is that in order to have a more holistic understanding of the emergence of the Chinese School of IR, we need to study it from a dialectical, historicist, and materialist approach. This is my today agenda. So the mainstream literature around the emergence of the Chinese School of IR could be organized around three narratives that I will unpack momentarily. The first narrative is what I have described as the Big Bang of 1979. So this narrative understands the emergence of the Chinese IR theory and the Chinese School of IR as a result of China's opening up in 1979. According to this narrative, IR theory did not exist in China prior to its opening up, and Chinese IR scholars had to learn IR theory from the Anglo-American IR academia. This in turn allowed Chinese IR scholars to develop their own theoretical indigenous frameworks. So despite the active agency of Chinese scholars in importing political realism, liberalism, or constructivism into China, this intellectual process has been implicitly rendered in a passive way, in the sense that Chinese IR scholars had to learn the superior and scientific form of knowledge that existed in the Anglo-American IR community and didn't exist during the Maoist era. So it's not a coincidence that the Marxist theory that was produced during Maoism was described by some Chinese scholars as the viewpoints of Marx, Lenin, and Engels, and not as a theory. So against this backdrop, I would argue that this narrative was primarily aimed at legitimizing China's opening up and breaking up with the knowledge that was produced during Maoism. It's important to note that 1979 marked a watershed for the production of Chinese international theory for multiple reasons. Firstly, China's opening up and the liberalization of the production of knowledge promoted by Deng Xiaoping allowed a greater intellectual autonomy that in turn paved the way for the emergence of a more pluralistic IR community where Chinese IR scholars engage with different IR theories. Secondly, 1979 allowed American philanthropical foundations such as the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation to shape the production of IR knowledge in China. And young Chinese IR scholars were able to be educated in prestigious Anglo-American universities. Thirdly, the arrival of Anglo-American IR theory paved the way for the emergence of this specific form of IR knowledge that we all know as the Chinese School of IR. However, this narrative is problematic because it presents an internalist understanding of the production of knowledge in China that celebrates the liberal turn of the Chinese state. In addition to this, it also presents this intellectual process almost as an inevitable step that Chinese IR scholars had to take in order to produce scientific IR theory, which of course disregards previous forms of knowledge that have existed in China, and it discounts the importance of the structural dynamics that shape Chinese history throughout the 20th century. The second narrative is what I have described as the myth of Chinese nationalism. So this narrative interprets the production of Chinese IR theory and the emergence of the Chinese School of IR as a product of Chinese nationalism. And even though this interpretation is correct in pointing out the intertwined relation between the production of knowledge in China and Chinese nationalism, it falls into an internalist understanding where Chinese nationalism is depicted as a social phenomenon constituted through the internal dynamics of the Chinese state. So I believe that this narrative is problematic, not only for its internalist emergence, internalist understanding of Chinese nationalism, but also because it tends to disconnect the emergence of Chinese nationalism and its ideological shifts from a specific form of political economy and geopolitical conjuncture. The last narrative is that around the myth of the Confucian state. So this narrative suggests that the emergence of the Chinese School of IR has been possible due to the existence of a distinct cultural background from which Chinese intellectuals have been able to draw their ontological sources that have underpinned their theoretical projects. Even though I cannot neglect the impact of culture in the production of Chinese IR theory, I contend that the problematic aspect of this is the reification of culture. Despite the willingness of some Chinese scholars to transcend this problem, they all end up embracing Confucianism as the main ontological source that informs their IR theories. This not only offers an essentialist understanding of culture, where it is believed that China is a Confucian state, but also implicitly or explicitly connects the idea of Chineseness with Confucianism, neglecting the cultural plurality that exists within China and other political traditions that have existed in China, such as Marxism and the revolutionary and republican political thought of the early 20th century. So to sum up, the mainstream literature around the emergence of Chinese School of IR suffers from three main shortcomings: internalism, a deep historicism, and a profound cultural essentialism. This is my theoretical framework, which is still work in progress. I mainly draw on the work of Professor Kees van der Pijl, and I seek to reread his work with the aim of shedding light on the historical and structural elements that shape the emergence of the Chinese School of IR through a dialectical, historicist, and materialist approach. I would suggest that the emergence of the Chinese School of IR has been shaped by three main elements: the geopolitics between the Lochian Heartland and China after 1979, China's social development with a shifting political economy, and the specific form of the Chinese state, which I understand as a contender Homogeneity state-society complex. So now let me define and discuss these elements. The Chinese School of IR emerged against the backdrop of the evolution of a particular global political economy structured around the hegemonic Lochian Heartland and a set of contender states that have ended up being integrated to it or resisting peripheralization. So the Lochian Heartland is a network social and geoeconomic structure comprising a number of originally English-speaking states and a regulatory infrastructure. In the Lochian Heartland that emerged in 1688 is defined after John Locke's book, Two Treatises of Government. So the Lochian state is governed by a constitutional monarch controlled by a parliament, and the state serves as a largely self-regulatory civil society by protecting private property at home and abroad. The importance of the Lochian Heartland for international relations theory dwells in the fact that Western IR theory emerged in this transnational structure and it underpins its supremacy. Kees also argues that the liberal West tends to produce idealist conceptions of world order. So what we actually understand as Western IR theory is precisely the IR theory produced in this Lochian Heartland. On the other hand, the Homogeneity contender state society complexes have been historically formed as a response to the geopolitical pressures of the Lochian Heartland and the historical backwardness product of the uneven and combined development of capitalism. A prime example of this type of state society is the Soviet Union. So Van der Pijl defines its formation, drawing on Thomas Hobbes' famous book entitled The Leviathan, as a reference to the authoritarian prelude to the Lochian liberalization. The specificity of the Hobbesian configuration resides in the crucial importance of the state as the institution driving forward the social formation and preemptively shaping by acting sometimes revolution from above and its social institutions which have evolved organically, if not necessarily autonomously in the heartland. So the Hobbesian state society formation is ruled by a hegemonic state class whose reproduction depends on the confiscation of the state. So according to Van der Pijl, contender states tend to have a more realist power politics perspective. So the importance of this point for this presentation is that I will argue that what we understand as non-Western IR theory in the context of China is rather the IR theory produced in a contender state. So the geopolitics for the Lochian Heartland and the PRC has been central for Chinese IR scholars for two reasons. Firstly, it has been the frame of reference from which the fundamental questions that Chinese IR scholars attempted to address emerge. These problems have been primarily related to political issues on maintaining the political autonomy of the Chinese state, developing the accumulation of wealth of a backward state that faced a more advanced heartland, assessing the degree of disengagement or engagement and integration to this global structure. Secondly, this global structure has facilitated a multilinear circulation of knowledge and new ontological sources, such as Anglo-American IR theory, from the hegemonic states that make up the Lochian Heartland towards China. Yet, the production of the Chinese School of IR cannot be solely explained as a result of the impact that geopolitical dynamics have on the cultural and intellectual processes. The nature of the Chinese contender state also shaped its cultural and intellectual sphere. The Chinese school was shaped by its specific state form and its internal dynamics. More specifically, it has been shaped by China's concentric development, a revolutionary ideology embodied by Confucianism that represents a form of cultural nationalism, which is linked to the existence of a dual political economy constituted by neoliberal and state-led economic model, a nationalist foreign policy, and an internal counter-revolution that fostered the depoliticization of past forms of knowledge. So now let me analyze the Chinese School of IR. So when I refer to the Chinese School of IR, I refer to a loose group of Chinese IR scholars that have been working on producing Chinese IR theory during the last 20 years and have tended to draw on Confucianism and Anglo-American IR theories as the main ontological sources that have infused their IR theories. The main IR scholars of this school are Yan Xuetong, Qin Yaqing, Ren Xiao, that belongs to the Shanghai School, and Chao Tingyan, but I won't analyze his work today. It is important to know that they work on different traditions of thought and have antagonistic views about the future of this school. So quite often, the emergence of the Chinese School of IR has been understood as an intellectual movement that seeks to break with the Anglo-American tradition of IR, to seek a greater degree of representation in global affairs and in global circuits of IR knowledge. However, in my work, I locate the Chinese School of IR within a broader tradition of what I call modern Chinese international thought, which has been historically concerned with maintaining the political autonomy of the Chinese contender state and ensuring the accumulation of wealth necessary to catch up with the liberal West. So this apparent break that appears in the mainstream literature has to be understood not as a real rupture per se, but as a result of the specific way in which structural and social forces converge after 1979 in China and in the Lochian Heartland. So for this reason, the Chinese School of IR should be understood as a continuation from the standpoint of Chinese history and its intellectual history. So Kees van der Pijl argued that the English-speaking social thought, which dominates academia today, remains locked into this antinomy between materialist empiricism and religious idealist moral judgment. So I would contend that this antinomy was transplanted into China after 1979 and shaped the Chinese School of IR. However, I argue that the espousal of this antinomy by Chinese scholars was also constrained by the structural position of the Chinese contender state within global politics and its state nature. So in this light, the nature of the Chinese contender state partially constrained the disposal of certain ontological sources that were mobilized by Chinese IR scholars. After 1979, the internal counter-revolution that fostered the divorce with previous forms of knowledge, along with the emergence of a cultural nationalism linked to China's new political economy, shaped the intellectual path of the Chinese IR theorists. Like intellectuals who produced Chinese international thought prior to 1979, the Chinese School of IR also mobilized ontological sources that celebrated the primacy of the state. So in this context, Confucianism became the prime candidate to substitute the traditional role of Marxism in Chinese IR theory. In this context, Confucianism also acted as a Chinese form of liberal thinking that also legitimized China's capitalist turn and its integration into the globalized Lochian Heartland. So the main problem that shaped the Chinese School of IR hasn't been China's rise, but the political challenges that have derived from the integration of the Chinese contender state into the Lochian Heartland since 1979, which was the necessary step to catch up with the West after the exhaustion of the Maoist model. So now, let me briefly discuss the works of the main members of the Chinese School of IR. Yan Shuitong is the Dean of the Institute of Modern International Relations at Chinhua University, and he puts forward this idea of moral realism, which combine the main assumptions of realism and concepts of morality that derive from ancient Chinese thought. His moral realism has to be understood as Yan's attempt to legitimize the political autonomy of the Chinese contender state and promote a new Chinese leadership in global affairs. He theorizes about how a rising state is able to displace a hegemon, a dominant hegemon, through political legitimacy. His moral realism is indeed influenced by Confucianism, but also by the materialist empiricism characteristic of the Anglo-American IR theory. So despite his tendency to see global politics through the lens of real politics, Yan Shuitong does accept the coexistence of a bipolar system constituted by China's contender state and the US-led liberal heartland. So he implicitly assumes China's dual political economy and the capitalist relations that govern the Chinese contender state and the liberal West. Qin Yaqing is the president and professor of the China Foreign Affairs University, which is directly under the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He puts forward the idea of relational theory, and his theory has three main assumptions: interrelatedness, identities of social relations, and process. Interrelatedness refers to the world as being composed of continuous events and ongoing relations. Social relations shape identities and roles of social actors, and process is also a key concept in relational theory that is about becoming. Qin Yaqing's relational theory combines the Anglo-American religious idealist moral judgment with Chinese dialectics and Confucianism. In his work, we can also observe the ontological primacy of the state, yet it's diffused by the emphasis on social relations and processes. His work aims at legitimizing the integration of the Chinese contender state into the Lochian Heartland. His theory fosters an interpretation of global affairs where the process of globalization and global governance can be a harmonious one. Put it differently, his theory is aimed at legitimizing the coexistence of the Lochian Heartland and the Chinese contender state. And finally, Ren Xiao, who is professor of international relations in Fudan, has promoted the idea of social symbiosis. For this group of scholars, the nature of the world is pluralism, and this means that there are multiple civilizations, traditions, cultures, etc. Within a broader environment, the agents interact among them, and another point is the difference that exists within all the areas of human life And according to Ren, this difference is a byproduct of the endogenous development, whereby societies prioritize different values and local histories. Ren also argues that different agents can peacefully coexist, and their interaction doesn't need to eliminate differences. He also argues that different agents, through constructive interactions, can together achieve advancement. So Ren Xiao and the School of Shanghai are also legitimizing the specificity of the Chinese contender state against the expansionist nature of the Lochian Heartland. Like Qin Yaqin, Ren Xiao and the Shanghai School of Symbiosis attempt to offer an integration to the Lochian Heartland from the difference of the Chinese contender state. So to conclude, I would like to throw some key ideas at you. So firstly, I believe that this materialist understanding of the Chinese School of IR can enable us to have a more holistic understanding of its onset. And secondly, rather than understanding non-Western IR theory in a culturalist fashion, we should understand the Chinese School of IR as the product of the Chinese contender state, which is constituted by structural and internal social forces. Here, as a working hypothesis, even though I acknowledge how problematic is the binary between West and non-West, I would say that perhaps what we understand as a non-Western IR theory in some cases should be understood as the IR theory produced by contender states, which in the past also had an imperial experience. Of course, at the moment, the primary contender state is China, and the former contender states have disintegrated or joined the liberal heartland, but perhaps this argument could potentially open another avenue for understanding the so-called non-Western IR theory, which at times is infused by the demons of Orientalism and cultural essentialism. So perhaps 19th century German international thought, Soviet thought, and Chinese international thought had a lot in common. Thank you very much for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ferran. That's so interesting.
Thank you so much.
Especially in light of some of the work that I've done with Xu Hongqiu on the role of Ford and Rockefeller in Chinese economic thought, the economics discipline, and so on. So I'd like to ask you some more questions about that perhaps later on.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Juvaria, our own collaborator and maker of these webinars, to speak for about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Inderjeet. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great, thanks. So my talk is on fintech, philanthropy, and development. And this is related to knowledge and power because I discuss how philanthropy, development, and the agenda of fintechs are increasingly intertwined. So it really relates quite closely with what Tatiana discussed. So it would be nice if we could exchange some views at some point about this. But the broader context is that I have a working paper that's on the FinGeo website, which is essentially about fintech and philanthropy. But I've tried to tease out some of the themes about knowledge and power for this presentation for today. So I'm specifically interested in institutions, international institutions, and how they shape development agenda. And I've done some work already on the financial inclusion agenda, but I'm interested in expanding that further and discussing how fintech, particularly what I see as a digital identity agenda, is very closely linked to another agenda, which is security. So there are three organizations that I'm interested in discussing. So one is the CGAP, which is a World Bank subsidiary organization. It's the consultative group for alleviating poverty. The other organization is a newer global organization that's funded by donors and philanthropists. It's called ID4D. So it's an initiative that brings together a large coalition of different types of institutions, which I'll just go over shortly. And the third institution is the Financial Action Task Force, which was concerned primarily with money laundering, but they've sort of adopted this focus on countering terror finance. And I look at how philanthropy, fintech, and these organizations all collaborate. Now, to sort of really understand how this is related to development, I think it's important to see development as part of a shifting discourse. So the earliest form of the development discourse, emerges from the Cold War. You can even, a lot of scholars have found a starting point in 1949 when President Truman took office in the United States. And after that, you see that there are these very distinct shifts that take place. And there are a number of shifts that are possible to identify, but I'm primarily interested in three. So one is development as finance. The second is this emergence of a financial inclusion agenda. So it starts with microcredit, it becomes microfinance, it becomes inclusive finance, and then it further morphs and becomes this fintech agenda. And within all of these agendas, it's possible to see how FBD, the finance, philanthropy, development nexus, has gained increasing influence. If we want to see what sort of influence this finance, philanthropy, development complex exerts in the current development discourse, it's very useful to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. So there are 30 goals. Goal 17 is all about partnerships. So there are a number of very specific goals that talk about partnerships, but interestingly, a lot of the partnerships are financial. So there's a very heavy emphasis on finance. And the roots of this are in a 2003 event called the Monterey Consensus, which sees FFD, or finance for development, as a key feature of contemporary development. So there's a very important role for finance, which means there's an important role for banks, and there's also an important role for philanthropists who would be interested in contributing towards financing these goals. And when you break apart these financial goals, these financial agenda, you see that some of them get very specific. So previously it was financial inclusion, and now increasingly there's an emphasis on fintech. And within the fintech agenda, there's an emphasis on digital identity. Now, this is just some selected goals, some selected targets taken from the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can see that there's quite a heavy emphasis on finance. So the target 17.3 is about mobilizing financial resources. Then there's another one about investment. And then there's another one about knowledge sharing. So there are very close relationships between disbursing finance for development and for knowledge sharing. And over the next few slides, I'll see how, I'll discuss how this has actually been done, how these international institutions have collaborated to not only sort of disperse what they feel is their version of development knowledge, but also how it's financed. And my particular interest is in target 16.9. So target 17 is all about partnerships, but target 16 is about legal obligations. And one of them is about providing universal legal identity, including birth registration. Now, to really understand the sort of template that these international organizations are following, it's very instructive to look at the example of the CGAP or CGAP. And these are some of the organizations that collaborate with the CGAP. So it's quite a wide range of institutions. And you'll see that some of them are distinctly financial institutions. So there's the MasterCard Foundation, there's Deutsche Bank. And then there are other organizations that want to behave like financial organizations. So they're not financial organizations, but they've chosen to adopt strategies that are very much like financial organizations. So one is the CDC. The CDC is part of DFID or UK Aid. And DFID is the Department for Funding International Development, and the CDC is their investment arm. So it operates something like an impact investment firm, and what they do is that they find investments in developing countries that have a social impact as well, and they put their money in these investments. And the International Finance Corporation, of course, is affiliated with the World Bank. And then there's KfW, which is Germany's donor organization, and there's USAID. And then there are philanthropies like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Omidyar Network. And some of the other organizations are alliances that have a distinct financial inclusion agenda. So main success of CGAP has been in mobilizing a wide range of organizations to collaborate with and to make them part of their financial inclusion agenda. This has been hugely successful. The success of this is reflected in how any financial inclusion initiative in any developing country will get a lot of support. And by support, I mean intellectual support from the CGAP. So a lot of the standards, regulations, guidelines all come from the CGAP. And this is supported by a wide range of organizations. Now, as the agenda for financial inclusion has evolved, and it's undergone many shifts. So it started out with microcredit, which is a very grassroots initiative. Microcredit started out by primarily lending to poor women. So there was a gender dimension also, and the World Bank got behind it very quickly. And then microcredit evolves, it becomes microfinance, and microfinance includes insurance and savings instruments and so on. And then again, it evolves and it becomes financial inclusion, which can mean a lot of things. And now the primary sort of the most popular term that development strategists or practitioners use is inclusive finance. And that's an interesting shift because it moves away from sort of just specific banking products to a broader agenda. And then fintech becomes part of this agenda. So the whole focus on fintech comes from these shifts. Now, fintech has a broader context, of course. There's already an existing discussion about how technology is very important for development. So there's this concept of ICT-4D, which is Information Communications Technology for Development. And some scholars see a shift within ICTD. So there's ICTD 1.0. So that was when there were community-owned devices. So there was television, radio, and this could sort of help decision-making, political awareness, and so on. But as personal mobile phones become substitutes for ICTD 1.0, we start talking about ICTD 2.0. And the mobile phone is seen as this completely transformative device. And the success of M-Pesa has been, it's documented. There are a number of studies. There are a number of critiques also, but it's a huge and very influential example of what technology can do for development. And then this is reflected in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. So in many parts of the Sustainable Development Goals, there are mentions of mobile phones. They're described as enablers for all 17 of the SDGs. They're also seen as central to the delivery of other SDGs. And this has provided this rationale for a stream of financial technologies or fintechs, and they combine profitability with social goals. So because of fintech, the double bottom line or even the triple bottom line agenda really takes off, because you can actually, you can sell mobile phones to people, or you can create apps, and these apps have multiple purposes. So they're not just profitable, they're also beneficial for social goals. Now, my focus in this presentation is on two countries in South Asia. So I'll discuss India and Pakistan. And I think these are particularly interesting countries because they have a long history with microfinance. So microfinance, as we all probably know, started in Bangladesh. And the structures that sort of made it successful in Bangladesh were present in other South Asian countries too, particularly this very powerful structure of informal money lending, and microfinance sought to replace that. So microfinance has been quite successful and has gained a lot of traction in South Asia, as it has in other places. It's also interesting that South Asian countries have been quite active with their biometric digital identification databases. And this has colonial roots in it. Mahmood Mamdani talks about the concept of define and rule, which is slightly different, or maybe even an elaboration of the concept of divide and rule, which is a commonly accepted version of how colonization was successfully done in South Asia. Now, digital financial inclusion, as I mentioned, has it comes from existing agenda, but the convergence of these multiple agenda is that there is that information and communications technology are key tools for financial access and therefore development. So it's become a very strong part of any discussion about development. Then there's the emphasis on private sector funding. There is this consensus that development initiatives need private sector funding. So it's not just something that's the responsibility of the state or international organizations. And then thirdly, and this is probably the newest aspect of the consensus, that the lack of digital identification impedes development initiatives. And this became increasingly clear as there were multiple refugee crises over the last 2 decades. And there was this increasing awareness that there has to be more done about identification, because a lot of people can't access benefits, not because those benefits don't exist, but because they don't have the identification to access those benefits. Even within the financial inclusion discussion, a common theme is that poor people can't access finance because they lack documentation. So the solution for that has been framed as digital identification. So if digital identification is available, that means that documentation is easily available and financial access, other forms of social assistance immediately become accessible as well. And as a result, the identification agenda finds itself in the SDGs. And like mobile phones and financial access, it's a key enabler for many other SDG goals and targets. And because of this, it gets the support of large philanthropic organizations as well as international institutions, and so on. So within this digital identity agenda, which appears in the form of, sorry, I'll just get to that later, which appears in the form of the ID4D initiative, there are interesting overlaps between financial access and ID4D. So you can see that the number of people who don't have ID is estimated at 1.5 billion. That's roughly the same amount as the number of people who are described as unbanked or financially excluded. So there are very strong links between not having identification and not having financial access. But one more aspect of this agenda is security. So digital identity is useful because it allows people to have mobile money, financial access, access apps, and so on. It's also useful because it facilitates G2P, or government to person transactions. So governments can hand out the benefits and transfers much more easily if they can identify who it's going to. But another sort of very important driver has been the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force. Now, this is quite a fascinating organization. It was established in the 1990s. It was a G7 body, and it was primarily fixated on money laundering. And after 9/11, it sort of rapidly transformed itself, and it became this organization that became a watchdog for terror finance. They operate through this process of through this rather threat of blacklisting. So there are only 2 countries that are blacklisted. I think it's North Korea and Iran. And there are other countries on the gray list. And but that's quite a small number. But being on the gray list it's quite a big deal. So it would have huge implications for your banking sector if you were a gray listed country. And the Financial Action Task Force is also quite interested in digital identity. So if you look at their documentation, as this digital identity agenda has kicked off, they've sort of spoken to it quite clearly, and they're quite encouraging about fintech, even though they recognize the risks. But for them, digital identity is a means to counter money laundering and terror finance. So this is, yeah, so I should have seen this earlier. This is FATF, and the primary focus on AML and CFT. Now, because of this, in 2016, you see this ID4D multi-donor trust fund pop up, and this is funded by a number of organizations. So there's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Omidyar Network, the Australian government, and a number of other very large influential organizations. And this has become now a very important part of the global development agenda as reflected in the SDGs and so on. Now, what does this mean on the ground? What is this meant for countries that have availed this sort of guidance in this discourse, and countries that were already quite big on biometric data as well? So I'm talking primarily about India and Pakistan. So both these countries have a history with biometric data. They've used it quite effectively for development. So in Pakistan, for instance, when there were floods in 2010, one of the relief measures was cash transfers, and this was done using Visa cards. So the whole financial access discussion again gained prominence because financial access was a prerequisite for gaining assistance, but was also seen as as sort of an added benefit of this sort of system of disbursement. And in India and Pakistan both, over the COVID pandemic, you've seen this sort of mechanism used increasingly, where people are identified based on their biometric information and then given welfare. The issue then is that if you don't have a digital identity, you don't have any access to welfare. Now, what this has also meant is that there's a large number of private sector organizations that can participate in what they call development initiatives by creating apps. And this is done through what we call a stack model. So a stack model relies on APIs. APIs are programs that enable two other programs to talk to each other. So that means that on my phone, for instance, an API is what's responsible for linking my payment app to my bank account. And the stack model is increasingly being used to connect biometric databases with other programs. So if you're a developer and there's a biometric database, the stack model is what the government endorses to allow more and more people to build on this database and create applications for verification. And this is seen, I mean, this is, it's a business move for fintechs, but there are added benefits, right? So if you're, there's a gender sort of discussion about if you can download an app to use a cab, then, the government is seen as sort of promoting gender equality in transport and so on. So all of these applications always wind up having like a financial access or gender equality discussion attached to them. The problem with this is that it gives a huge amount of importance and influence to the private sector. So in India, this became controversial because most of the fintech, the applications developed that have access to the biometric database are from the private sector. And this was done because a group of developers essentially set up something called iSpirit, the Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable. And they were, questioned for having access to this biometric database, which is quite sensitive information. In Pakistan, they tried to follow a similar model. They hired somebody from Google who tried to advance this model by setting up a similar organization to iSpirit. It was called the Digital Pakistan Foundation. And then there were lots of questions about what the linkages to this independent philanthropic organization are to the government, and questions about transparency, access to biometric data and sensitive information arose again. So there is this issue of revolving doors, conflict of interest. And when you have an FPD, a finance philanthropy development model, it's very unclear how it's fair, who gets to have access, and who gets to make decisions on how these models are deployed. So that's all from me, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I don't see Urvashi, although I did email her just now. Actually, hang on. I think Urvashi, if you're here, please speak now. This is
Yes,
your...
I'm here.
Oh, great.
Uh,
Okay. Thank you,
yeah,
Juvaria. That's really interesting. It's a lot of the IP is a bit beyond my pay grade, I think, but it'll be interesting to see what questions come up as well. But thank you so much. Okay, Urvashi, the floor is yours. You have about 20 minutes
okay.
to make your presentation. Thank you.
So I want to perhaps start by talking a little bit about the US India relationship, and why perhaps the United States is India's most important ally, and has been for at least the last 2 decades, if not more. And we can trace this from 1991, which is the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and where India realized that it would have to cultivate its alliances more closely with the United States. So if you look at the India-US relationship, there are 4 or 5 um, aspects which are very important to the relationship. It's trade, it's access to markets, uh, purchase of defense equipment, and the interests of more than millions of Indian workers who work in the United States. And for India, on a geopolitical level, it's important to have a very powerful ally to counterbalance China, who's always been a threat to India in many ways. And also, with the United States control over the monetary system, uh, you know, and also major institutions, access to aid. So it's very important that India stays in the good books of the United States. And for example, in 1998, when India conducted its nuclear tests, the United States imposed major military and economic sanctions. And so India was denied access to aid, access to imports, uh, could not do defense purchases, couldn't access US bank loans. So it did impact India. Uh, and I think, in my understanding at least, if we look at India US relations of the past 2 decades, there have been three major instances where India has felt this need to impress its interests on the United States, or at least to make a case for itself. One was the 1998 nuclear tests. The second was the India-US nuclear deal of 2008. And then more recently, 2019, when India, changed the constitutional status of Kashmir, um, and also changed its citizenship laws. And both of uh, these actions were met with widespread sort of criticism from across the world, and especially the United States. And if you've been following the news from India, you'll also know that there have been major pharma agitations, which also have attracted criticism from the United States. And for India, it's very important to sell its image as as a democracy, which it is, and also as country which is open for business, and a country which respects human rights. And a lot of this is about image building. And there are various mechanisms which the government has in order to do this. The first is obviously, the embassy, the formal embassy route. And then there are, bodies like the industry bodies, the business and industry bodies like FICCI and CII. CII is the Confederation of Indian Industry, and FICCI is the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which make a case for which sort of lobby for Indian business interests in the US. And there are, individuals. The role of individuals in the India-US relationship is important, where let's just say businessmen uh, use their personal clout and influence uh, to advocate for causes that India is interested in. And India also hires lobbying firms in the United States, in Washington D.C., such as Cornerstone Government Affairs and BGR Government Affairs, and these lobbying firms are hired to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars, literally every quarter. And then there is, of course, the think tank, which is sort of a more the recent entrant to uh, the mechanisms which India has started to use to lobby its interests in the United States. And sort of the most evident example of this is the Observer Research Foundation, which is India's most visible and prominently marketed think tank. And uh, Observer Research Foundation, or ORF, a little bit of background on the think tank, is basically founded by Reliance Industries, which is India's biggest corporation. And the core funding to the think tank comes from Reliance Industries. But the think tank has always claimed itself to be independent, autonomous, which, if you look at its work, if you look at its employees, and you look at its funding, you kind of know it's not. But ORF in recent times has become very prominent because it hosts the Raisina Dialogue. The Raisina Dialogue is sort of, you can understand it as something that is equivalent to the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is conducted by the IISS in London and the government of Singapore. And the Raisina Dialogue, in the recent years, at least, has become a platform for the Quad countries to articulate their positions. And sometimes, the sort of hostility against China as well. So, so this is the background of ORF, India's most important think tank, conducts the most sort of prominent dialogue in Asia, in South Asia at least, the foreign policy dialogue in South Asia. And uh, in 2019, it set up a branch in Washington, D.C. And a couple of things to note about the launch of this think tank in Washington, D.C. First was the timing of the launch. It happened in around September 2019. This was the time when the Indian government was, facing, was facing the height of criticism because of its actions in Kashmir, because of how it was tinkering with its Citizenship Amendment Act. And this was the time when Observer Research Foundation announced its DC launch at an event which was sort of co-sponsored by Heritage Foundation, which is an ultra-conservative think tank in the United States. Um, and interestingly, they got the Indian Foreign Minister's son to head this think tank. And so it was very clearly, sort of reproduction of a certain sort of an elite, where India's External Affairs Minister is S. Jaishankar, and the Jaishankar family has a tradition of kind of embodying the foreign policy elite, which is upper caste, which is extremely influential, which is very elite, and it's sort of a kind of a cycle of uh, reproducing the same elite, and this time to sort of head uh, India's sort of richest think tank, and that too in Washington D.C. And there can never be any doubt about what its intentions are. So the other thing about that I wanted to sort of talk about is that how influential is the ORF in the United States? So whenever there's a major India-US dialogue, for example, there's a defense sort of agreement, there are defense talks. Sorry about that. ORF in the US, becomes a sort of a conduit. It becomes the official spokesperson, literally like the quasi-official, uh, spokesperson for the government, which will give its official bites, widely quoted in the media on India-US relations. And all of this is sort of published by the media without any sort of questioning of why ORF in Washington DC, why the External Affairs Minister's son, why should he be heading it, and why is Reliance Industries putting its money in such a venture? These kind of questions are never really asked, but it's very clear that they're very influential in that particular space, and that is what they intended to do. And obviously, with the there is a lot of attention on China as well, but since think tanks work very closely with the government and they want to align themselves with government goals, so they are going to watch the transition from the Trump to the Biden administration and maybe reconfigure their position in the Quad accordingly. So this confluence, between sort of government and corporate goals is not new. Um, but what I would like to point out is that the think tank has now become an acceptable way for government to channelize influence, because think tanks are fuzzy institutions. Most of them pass off as independent, as autonomous, and as sort of intellectual spaces where you're free to think and write. But as we know, that is often not the case. But think tanks have that sort of veneer of respectability as well, and governments, especially the government of India, through think tanks at home in India and the ORF in Washington DC, is channelizing its views, and also channelizing its influence. Um, and if you look at how businessmen, kind of how Indian business invests in think tanks, it's very common for them to do so. They will not do it in like huge amounts. They will not, put a lot of their money in it, but there is a significant amount of money still going in little by little into various think tanks. And this is an acceptable way for businesses to actually influence policy, the way, the direction that policy takes. Um, and larger corporate goals such as privatization, think tanks become a very convenient way for corporates to achieve that goal. And often there is an alignment between state and corporate goals, where there's state which is looking to sell its assets, which is looking to disinvest, and there are like business houses which want to kind of create that opinion, that sort of that mindset where where perhaps they would want more privatization to take place. And even if you look at the Indian independence struggle, for example, the Birlas had a major role in funding the Indian National Congress. The Tatas have had a major role in Indian nation building and built many institutions which are very important even today. So business and state have always gone very closely together, and Indian governments have also used businessmen in diplomacy abroad, in what is now called the privatization of diplomacy. And there are umpteen instances where this has actually happened. So, I'd also want to talk about uh, this particular launch of a think tank in 2019 in Washington, D.C. Why didn't India do it earlier, for example? I think India didn't do it earlier is because, first of all, 2019 was that particular moment in Indian politics where it took some major decisions which had, worldwide sort of consequences. And so it needed more than just embassy and formal efforts to make its case in Washington. So there was this think tank whose launch was very aptly timed. Um, the second thing is ORF has always wanted a US presence. It's also because Indian corporates now have major investments abroad, especially in the United States. Uh, so for them, this was the culmination of a long goal. And thirdly, it's not every corporate house is just able to kind of uh, launch a think tank in Washington, DC. You need a lot of resources, you need a lot of clout and influence. And for Reliance Industries, which is India's biggest corporation, and Mukesh Ambani, who is Asia's, I think, richest man to date, for them, it was easy to do this. But it won't be so easy for other corporate houses. So as you can see, there's this alignment of state and corporate goals that we see, where corporate India also wants to kind of extend its efforts towards, Indian diplomatic measures. And uh, yeah, I think for I think to conclude, I just want to say that we might actually see more Indian think tanks coming up in Washington, D.C., and we should not be surprised if they are back, if they have corporate funding, because as I think in different countries, corporate and state benefit from each other, and the US is like a fertile kind of a market for Indian corporates. So I think they'd want to do that to advance their own goals as well as the Indian state goals. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Urvashi. Really interesting research. And is it something you're publishing soon, or you have started publishing yet?
Uh, so one part of that is already published with Caravan magazine, where I looked at the conflict of interest because of the foreign minister's son being hired to work for ORF in Washington, D.C. That part that has already been published, but a newer part of my research is now looking at the politics of the Raisina dialogue uh, and what it aims to influence, through using India's Right to Information Act, and also looking at, uh, the specifics of uh, India hiring lobbying firms in Washington, D.C., and what those lobbying firms are being hired for and what they are actually achieving, and why the Indian government is spending thousands of dollars of taxpayer money uh, on lobbying in the United States. Yeah, that's my sort of ongoing research, which will still take time to publish, I think, because yeah, it's still ongoing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. We've got a couple of questions. So to members of the audience, thank you very much for being here. And a couple of people have already asked questions in the Q&A through the Q&A format. So I would urge you please to start typing in your questions, and I will then direct them towards our speakers. So we have a question for Tatiana from an anonymous attendee who asks, you said that the time frame that you looked at, the view in the US was that Brazil doesn't really know what it wants. What do you think that this view, why do you think this view was so common? You're muted, Tatiana.
Oh, I don't know. I should start to answer. Well, I have also questions for the other attendees, so I don't know if we can just answer or make my questions too.
Go
Well,
ahead.
I think it's, I didn't give a lot of context for this idea that appear a lot in my interviews, but I believe it was a way of delegitimizing the intentions of Brazil of having more projection and of being a global power, as if in the interviews, the perception I had is that most of the time Brazil was seen as a child that, you know, wasn't mature enough and didn't know what it wanted in terms of politics and should not be meddling in high politics. This was just for big powers, if I could select this. So I see political bias in this kind of analysis, and that's why it was so common. It was not of anyone's interest to have Brazil as a great power, with considering the resources it had at the time. So just wanted to ask Urvashi. I think we have a lot of in common in terms of the perception about the work of think tanks. And I was in doubt if this institution you mentioned was in fact an advocacy group or a lobby itself. And if it was, the rules are completely different. So I don't know how it would be handled in by Washington, because if it's a lobby or advocacy, then you have to see the foreign agents and register like this. So it's just a question. For I'll make my 3 questions and then I just mute. For Ferran, you said that non-Western IR theory could be you considered as produced by contender states, and I was thinking if China plans to make its own IR theory as perhaps mainstream, how would it deal with the barriers of language and culture? I mean, if it wants to replace, so to speak, American IR theory, which is still considered Anglo-Saxon model and basis for international relations field. And for Juvaria, what I wanted to, it's not actually a question, but comment that some thoughts that your presentation made me had. This technology use and the mobile phone, I was thinking about the political impact of this, social and political impact that we saw in Brazil and also in India, the results of the election with all the fake news on WhatsApp and other social media. So I don't know if it's on in your radar. I don't know if it's the right proposition. And this, I mean, it seems that neoliberalism is putting it more and more citizenship connected to consumerism, and we are going to, people are now, scholars are now using this idea of capitalism of vigilance. So I don't know if it's also on your radar that we are becoming algorithms and numbers ourselves as citizens. Our citizenship is being determined by Also, it's out of our control. Well, that's
Thank you.
you.
Urvashi, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. Yeah.
You want to go first, please?
I think Observer Research Foundation is registered as a 501c3 organization in Washington. So I think it's registered as a non-profit. It's not registered as a foreign agent. I don't know that. I mean, if you're kind of engaging in uh, kind of political activity on behalf of another government, you need to register as a foreign agent. But I don't think ORF is registered as a foreign agent. They're registered as a 501c3, sort of, which is a very broad, category for organizations of various hues to register under, like nonprofits and associations and think tanks as well. So yeah, and but and how would the U.S. government deal with them? I'm not very sure. I'm sure they have all of that in place. I don't think they'd be, violating any laws or anything. But uh, uh, there is too much of uh, you know, sort of coincidences in the way it's been set up, in the way they got the foreign minister's son to head it, um, in the way they work so closely with government and, host, one of the most important dialogues, foreign policy dialogues in Asia. Too many sort of convergences to ignore, and I don't know, at some point they may actually register as a foreign agent. We can't rule out the possibility. Yeah, but no, let me take that back. I don't think that they would do that, because they call themselves independent, autonomous. So for them to say that they're a foreign agent would, I think, be a bit much. So I actually don't know how they'd be going about their work. Yeah.
Although it's interesting, Urvashi, that Chinese organizations and other countries, or like Russian ones as well, some of whom don't have necessarily a kind of such a close link with the state, have been forced to register as foreign agents, partly because of the geopolitical rivalry. So there could be some kind of political incentives there to sort of not take the same stance against India, because they're much closer and it's a part of a strategic partnership against China to a degree as well.
That's a very interesting point that you've raised. But uh, the way I see it is, I think their activity would be like very sort of clearly defined. I don't think they would be sort of making any wrong moves, and maybe a lot of the stuff would be happening informally, uh, in person to person conversations, rather than in more sort of in your face sort of lobbying. I think that's how many of these things work, especially in the context of think tanks. So and they would really want to preserve their appearance of being independent. So but yeah, it's an interesting point that you raised.
I mean, one of the things, of course, is given that you said that there's so much criticism of various moves in India into Jammu and Kashmir, but also the citizenship laws, that has created quite a kind of critical environment for India and the BJP government in the United
Yes.
States and other parts of the world as well. So I
Uh,
wonder,
uh,
is the ORF branch in DC, is it carrying out some sort of public education, public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy campaign, which is sort of more broadly directed at kind of elite opinion, say in the media and elsewhere?
so two as parts to your question. First is the Bharatiya Janata Party has actually registered itself as a foreign agent in the United States. There's Overseas Friends of BJP, and they have registered themselves as a foreign agent again just last year. Um, and the second part of your question is, um, I think what ORF and, let's say, even the Indian Embassy and all other sort of stakeholders in this relation, sort of formal elite stakeholders in the relationship, would try to do is maybe not talk about Kashmir, not talk about China, but talk about areas of convergence, like the Quad, for example. or areas where they can cooperate rather than sort of raising issues on which there will be a difference of opinion, especially considering uh, there's a administration in power. So I was looking at the ORF in America website today, and it's about China, it's about post-COVID scenes in America. I don't think they would be sort of in your face, sort of talking about Kashmir, or they wouldn't be doing that. They'd be sort of this kind of reminds me of the Foreign Affairs Minister's visit to Washington in 2019. Just days before his son was declared head of ORS Washington DC branch. So Jaishankar, the father, um, he did the route, he did a circuit of like 7 think tanks in Washington and New York, like in Brookings and Carnegie, to all of those places. And I was reading the transcripts, and there was very little mention of Kashmir or some of the more contentious issues. There was more highlighting of shared issues of cooperation on which India and US can cooperate on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Ferran, Tatiana asked you a question also, so maybe this is your chance to have a go at that, please.
Yeah, it was a very difficult question, I have to say. I think that in politics, I would say everything is about timing and power, I think. So if we talk about now, I would say that I don't see Chinese scholars really wanting to change or to substitute Anglo-American higher theory. And here I have 2 reasons. Firstly, they are not interested in changing the material structure that underpins that ideational ideas, right? So if you look at their theoretical prepositions, they are interested in the coexistence of, let's say, the Chinese state and the liberal order, right? They're not interested in changing the very system that allows that asymmetric like power relation that also shapes like the production of knowledge, right? And I think that here, if you know the work of Robert Cox, I think that the production of knowledge in China is like this. It's more like a problem solving like theories, where they're more interested in solving those problems rather than changing the actual system. And I think that at best they might be able to shape like the field of area studies, but I don't see Chinese thought shaping like these hardcore questions that we have about international system, like the political economy and all of that. But I might be mistaken. Maybe in 30 years, it might be different.
Ferran, I wonder if I might ask you a follow-up question to that. Reading recently the book by Mobo Gao, hopefully that's pronounced correctly, Constructing China, he makes a kind of pitch, sort of really a Marxist pitch, to show how the transformation of Marxist-Leninist, Maoist thought, which had a very different idea about international relations, international relationships, the centrality of class and class alliances, compared or contrasted with what happened with Deng Xiaoping. I just wonder if you looked at the transformation or the moment of transformation, the process of transformation from that kind of as official Chinese thought, state thought, to what you described, and how exactly that process occurred, and which period it particularly occurred within. The second question I would ask is, how close is the kind of range of theories that you described to the thought of Xi Jinping and the Politburo or the Communist Party Central Committee, as in their theories of IR? Are these 3 approaches that you talked about, are they effectively encompassing the IR theorizing of the regime, if you like?
The first question, yes, it's something that I'm trying to study in my thesis. I would say that one of the main elements that have, shaped this transformation in the production of knowledge in China is what I call well, Van der Peel calls, not me, this internal like counter-revolution, which is basically a little bit like what he argues is that he talks about the Soviet Union, right? And he talks about how Marxist, so the reason why the Soviet Union collapsed was because Marxist thought codified in his thought the defeats of the revolutionary movements, right? What happened in China is that Mao, and he argues that the Stalinism is a form of this internal counter-revolution, because the idea of socialism in one country, it reflects that, okay? So what happened is Mao Zedong, he embraced the idea. So he already embraced this defeat already, right? And I think what happens in the transformation of international thought is that because of the relation between China and the Soviet Union, and later on, like this reorientation of China to the West, there was this internal counter-revolution that it basically allowed like Chinese scholars to divorce from Marxist theory. Of course, now after the 1979, there's some Marxists in China, but I would say that, interestingly, I would say that non-Western theory in the context of mainstream Chinese IR has been functional to this divorce from past forms of knowledge, right? And because if you think about it, like all the great scholars that we know now that they work on the Chinese School of IR, they're not interested in promoting like Chinese Marxism or even Republican thought in the 20th century, or, you know, and I think we need to understand this as a process of this internal counter-revolution, and also the dynamics of the geopolitics between China and the Soviet Union and China and the West. In regards to your second question, it's very difficult to know this because of the way how the structure of knowledge works in China. I would say that it's very difficult because, and even I recently read a book that it talks about this. What is the actual connection between the scholars and the state? It's very difficult to know. It's very difficult to know because I think, for example, I would say that yes, Qin Yaqing, he is the president of this university who is under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you might guess that he might have some sort of connection there, but I haven't explored that. So yeah, I think that's difficult to know, really. I haven't explored that.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth having a look because
yes.
the material connections, the ideological, political connections, then you looked at the American institutions, which have been funding various kinds of scholarship as well. And I think that is obviously going to be a very powerful set of factors as well. Thank you so much. Juvaria, I think Tatiana, who's now co-chairing this webinar, has also asked you a question. So why don't you please respond to that?
Yeah, so I think it's an interesting one about the political implications because, I mean, there are sort of two discussions over here, right? One is what can, what can governments do with digital identity, right? Like, can they control dissent? Can they sort of control, can they crack down on people who are dissenting? And, is this sort of a deterrent towards activity, right? If the government has all your data, does that mean that you're going to be more scared of sort of speaking out? Are you going to be more scared of using social media and so on? And you've seen that happen. I mean, there are instances of people whose accounts have been shut down and that sort of thing. They've been traced through there. And in both Pakistan and India, SIMs are biometrically verified. So if you have a phone number, I mean, you can sort of, get a lot of information out of that. The other part of the question is about citizenship, right? And somebody I think has asked something similar in the questions, that how does does this change the relationship of individuals to the state, right? Because if you're identified, that means you're going to be classified. That means you're going to be sort of put into a certain category, and does that affect the way you interact with the state? So far, I think, at least in Pakistan, that hasn't been an issue. I think that's also because people are sort of used to being classified. It's just become a lot more streamlined and technological now, but everyone's quite comfortable with the government having their data. And there have been incidents of this being, used adversely, but I don't think there have been enough to create sort of widespread concern. I think in India, this became a lot more concerning when they were amending the Citizenship Act, and what that meant was that a lot of people would effectively just become stateless, right? So if they weren't on a register, then they weren't going to be issued digital identification, and if they weren't issued digital identification, they didn't have a claim to the state. The thing is with the Aadhaar system, they clarify that this is not proof of citizenship. Whereas the difference is in Pakistan, if you're on the system, that means you are either a citizen or a resident, but it's quite clear. So depending on what sort of identification you have, it's easier to distinguish. But because the Aadhaar system is sort of it's not newer, but the newer rollouts have been a little concerning because they're connected to the sort of amendments that they're making in Parliament and so on. So yeah, definitely there are concerns. There are huge political impacts of this sort of system, and we're probably going to see a lot more sort of protests and resistance to this sort of thing. But at the same time, it's not just in the global south or in South Asia, right? So even in the UK, for instance, there was a huge backlash against the COVID app, right? Because people thought that the government is going to sort of be able to link this with their NHS number, and they're going to be able to track their movements. And in countries like the UK, especially the UK, there's a lot of resistance to identification, right? There have been various occasions on which the government has tried to introduce identification cards, and it's been met with a lot of resistance, and they've just had to back down, right? The most recent one probably was after the the attacks in 7/7, and they thought that sort of a biometric, well, the most recent was probably after Brexit, where they thought they'd give it to people who are claiming settlement, but none of that went through because it's just not something that's acceptable over here.
Okay. Tatiana, I'd like to ask you a question, actually, if I may. Now, we've had a talk about China and the way in which China as a contender state appears to have kind of created a hybrid theorizing which justifies and legitimizes its position in the international order. Now we had a presentation from Urvashi about Indian think tanks and the attempt to smooth the relationship between India as a rising power into the American system, including in various partnerships like the Quad. Is there an equivalent movement in Brazil of Brazilian institutions, think tanks, which, if you like, have kind of tried to develop a concept for Brazil, which is where does Brazil fit into that international order, and any attempts, if you like, to promote that in the United States?
Well, you're asking now during this government or recent days? It's because now we are living in a situation that everything, the connections and even our strong and recognized diplomatic tradition is being under threat in this government, Bolsonaro's government. So I think we are we stop it a little. We have, of course, other agents in society that are working. The country has not, I mean, stop it. But in terms of something official, I don't know. It's we have, as I said in my presentation, we have in terms of think tanks, we have the same institutions, and it's interesting. This is something I forgot to say. The institutions that are considered legitimate, and even the scholars and the persons, individuals that are consulted about Brazil, these individuals, most of them have international background or they studied abroad. So this is a label that it seems to be necessary to be heard, and to, if you, you are going to have some influence if you're being heard. You need to have that space, that open space. So that I think we need, first of all, to extend this, enlarge this possible voices that might be talking on behalf of Brazil. And well, we were trying to do this, but since I would say at least 2018 and mostly 2000 or before that, but especially now with 2019, we are having a break, I guess. It's
okay. Thank you. And it just occurred to me that there are these kind of transnational linkages of institutions which are private and public, which are
yes.
producing various kinds of knowledge, but also doing political lobbying. They're kind of, if you like, as Urvashi said, that there's some sort of informal diplomacy, which often goes on through and within these institutions. There's the kind of a production of knowledge itself. There's a creating of a
Well, we
climate.
have I'm sorry. We have a great movement with far-right organizations,
Right.
especially with Trump and some European countries. But this is not it doesn't comply the historic path of Brazil. And that one that was being followed now has a break.
Sure, sure. Well, look, we have gone way beyond our time, because the questions which have been raised have been really interesting. But one final thing, this occurs to me, that there's a perfect opportunity for people who are students of Brazil, of India, of China, and possibly Russia also, I don't know, or South Africa, to have a look at the kind of transnational relations of those countries and their knowledge production mechanisms and institutions, and their linkages with each other, but also with the kind of broader liberal international order centered on the US and Europe. And I think it would be quite interesting to see how those transformations of position and shifts in geopolitical position have been kind of thought about and written about. So it'd be quite interesting if you were to sort of set up a workshop where you would talk about these institutions as they operate, because there seem to be certain sort of commonalities between the three the examples that we've kind of heard to some extent. So thank you all so much, everyone, for your papers. Really very interesting, thought-provoking and challenging research. I want to thank everybody in the audience as well for persevering with us way beyond our time. But we did have 4 speakers this week, and just because there's so many interesting things that needed to be said. So as I said before, this is the 6th of 6 webinars in this first series. We're going to take a short break and do something else on Fridays at 4 p.m. for a few weeks, but we will be back on the 7th of May with something really interesting. As I said, the idea of China. So I think we're going to continue to explore certain big issues about world politics from various perspectives. And one of the things which I think unifies at least 3 of you, one of the papers is going to be on the China watchers in the United States. What is the composition, demographic, social, economic, racial, ethnic, ideological, and other, of those who professionally watch China in the US community, as well as 2 other speakers from outside of China giving their perspectives as well. So I think there seems to be some sort of synergies and interesting overlaps between some of the themes we've talked about today and what we're going to continue talking about in the next series. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a lovely weekend and so on. And we will see you again very soon. Posters and tweets and leaflets will be flying all over the world in due course. So thank you very much. Bye.